Ladies and gentlemen, hello. This is Dr. Frank Chase Jr. back again. It's been a while since I've done a tithing video, and today I decided I wanted to go back and do a recap of some things I've said in the past over the years to discuss this subject of tithing. And one of the things that I really want to talk about is Matthew 23:23, which has been misunderstood, taken out of context. The text has been improperly applied to the monetary tithe doctrine. So I want to spend some time on that today, not too much. Some of it is pretty self-explanatory, but I want to cover it anyway so that you will get an understanding that when you hear this verse in church, ladies and gentlemen, that Matthew 23:23 is talking about tithing under the law. It is not grace tithing. It is not free will giving. It's the law. Tithing is of the law. Now, what we're going to clear up is, what kind of tithing is it? What kind of tithing is being talked about in Matthew 23:23? So we want to clear up the out of context interpretation that has been heaped upon you over the centuries and over the years. So when we come back, I'm going to read that, and I'm going to start off in Leviticus because we got to get some context. So we'll be right back, and stay tuned because we're going to get into this really good. We'll be right back. We are back, so let's get into this. One of the things that's important to understand is, what is tithing? And in order to find that out, you really got to go to the beginning. And you're going to hear statements like, tithing is required today, monetary tithing is required today because it was before the law. And since the practice of it was before the law, that the requirement still exists that it should be practiced during the law and after the law. And that doctrine has been preached and preached and preached, but is incorrect, ladies and gentlemen. So before we get into the book of Matthew, let's look at the instance of what the tithe is as it is being laid out to the people of Israel as far as tithing in Leviticus and under the law, because Leviticus is a book of laws that are being set up for the people of Israel before they get to the promised land. So let's read this out of the, let's see, this is the contemporary English version. And so we're going to get some context here about what the tithe is, what was God setting up at that time. So it's Leviticus 27:30-33. 10% of everything you harvest, pay attention, 10% of everything you harvest is holy and belongs to me, whether it grows in your fields or on your fruit trees. As you can see, the law says the tithe comes from the land and comes from the fruit trees. If you want to buy back this part of your harvest, you may do so by paying what it is worth plus an additional 20%. Did you hear that? Verse 32. When you count your flocks and herds, 1 out of 10 of every newborn animal is holy unto me. No matter how good or bad it is, if you substitute one animal for another, both of them become holy, and neither can be bought back. That is the law version of the tithe. And for those of you who like the King James Version, I'm going to come back and read it out of the King James Version so that you can have some additional context. Okay, we are back. So let's look at this same scripture in Leviticus 27:30-33 in the King James Version, because I know a lot of you are used to the King James Version, so I wanted to read it out of there, even though the contemporary English version does give the context a better reading. So in the King James Version, it reads, "And all the tithe of the land, whether seed of the land or of the fruit tree, it is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will at all redeem aught of his tithes, he shall add thereunto the fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock, even of whatsoever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto the Lord." So what we have here is God setting out the standard and the practice of tithing. I'm talking about crops and livestock, ladies and gentlemen. The Bible does not talk about tithing money. And so when you read Leviticus, it tells you it's the harvest. It tells you it is the harvest that was being planted. That is what was tithed. And then it was not necessarily mandatory to tithe because you could buy it back. So in Leviticus, it states this: you can tithe your crops, but if you did not want to tithe your crops, you could do a buyback. That is called redemption. You buy it back. The priest would assess a value of that, and you would buy it back, your tithe, for that amount. But you had to pay a penalty for that, and it says it was an additional 20%, according to the CEB version. So you could keep your tithe, ladies and gentlemen. That's what the scripture says. Now, when it came to the herds and flocks, you could not buy that back. You had to pay every 10th animal of the herds and flocks because it was a requirement for that, and you couldn't buy that back because the priests and the Levites needed the herd and the herds and the flocks for their food and for sacrifices. So you could not do that. And that's why I wanted to bring out Leviticus first, because it is important you understand just the simple practice of agricultural tithing in the Bible. And so when you hear people read Leviticus and try to apply it to money, you already know you're being snowed. So we're going to go to Matthew because we want to see if tithing is still under the law. According to the Leviticus, tithing is under the law. People like to say tithing was before the law, but that is not correct. Now, I'll come back and I'm going to share with you why they allude to the tithing before the law and try to justify that you have to pay it because it was before the law, and now during the dispensation of grace, or whatever you want to call it, you still have to tithe. And they say that's not the law, but it really is the law. We'll be right back. Okay, I hope you all are getting something out of this, because if you don't read the scripture carefully in proper hermeneutics, you could mix something up. And so I mentioned to you in our previous segment that people often complain or make the argument tithing was before the law. And so if it's before the law, you got to pay it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they're talking about the tithe Abram paid in Genesis to Melchizedek. And the reason why they like to use that is because they're going to try to justify a monetary tithe in the New Testament, which cannot be justified. And so Abram paid a tithe to Melchizedek, but it was not the same tithe that was established under the law in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. And if you look at all the tithing scriptures and you compare scripture with scripture and you look at the nature and the practice of what Abram did when he paid the tithe, everybody knows, and the book of Hebrews even makes it clear, that Abram paid a tithe from the spoils of war. That was a spoils of war tithe. That's because Abram conquered kings, went against them in a battle, took back his nephew Lot, took the goods that the other soldiers and the other kings had, and piled it up in a heap, gave Melchizedek a tithe from that spoils of war, and then Abram didn't even take anything from that spoils of war at all. And then he gave back the stuff he took back to the other kings, especially the people, because they requested, Abram, can we have back our people that you took? And Abram did not take anything for himself, but he did give something to the men who went to battle with him. Now that was before the law in Genesis, but the tithe under Leviticus is being established as a law. And so by the time we get to the book of Matthew, people want to say that because we are under grace, you still have to tithe. Well, the tithe in Matthew is not the same tithe in Genesis, but the tithe in Leviticus being established is what's being talked about again in Matthew 23:23. So let's look at this when we come back, and then we're going to get into this, and I'm going to show you what was actually tithed in Matthew. We'll be right back. We are back. So line by line, a little bit here, a little bit there, we're going to really get to understanding what Matthew 23:23 is all about. So when you read chapter 23 of the book of Matthew, you know from the very beginning, when you read the first verse, this whole chapter is a rebuke of the Sadducees and Pharisees. They were messing up the law. They were messing up everything. And so Jesus come along, the Messiah, comes along and says, whoa, hold up, wait 1 minute. So the word woe is being used in almost every verse in chapter 23 of Matthew. Jesus was saying, hold up, y'all, wait 1 hot minute. What are you doing? And then he gets to verse 23 and tells them, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, and then he calls them hypocrites. Wait a minute. He calls them hypocrites. He says, for you pay tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, and mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Then in verse 24, he says, you blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. This was a rebuke. They were violating the law. They were putting emphasis where emphasis did not belong. Jesus was telling them, yes, you pay your tithe. He did not say income here. He said tithe of mint, anise, and cumin. And you neglect the weightier matters of the law. So they were so focused on making sure they're paying their tithes from the garden spices that they were growing at home, but they were not showing any mercy, they were not showing any faith, and they were not showing any justice, which was of the law. They weren't doing that. And he was not commending them for anything in Matthew chapter 23. He was woeing them. He was telling them to hold up. He was telling them to stop what they're doing and do it right. And so, as you can see, the tithe here that we're talking about is of the law. Because look, let me read this again in a different version of the Bible, the contemporary English version. Matthew 23:23 again. You Pharisees and teachers are show-offs. That's exactly right. And you're in for trouble. This is the Messiah speaking. You give God 1/10 of the spices from your garden. Did you hear that? You give the 1/10 of your spices from your garden, such as mint, dill, and cumin. Yet you neglect the more important matters of the law, such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These are the important things you should have done. The important things they should have done is what? Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The tithing from their garden spices was not that important. These are the important things you should have done, though you should not have left the other undone. So he was telling them, no, you should not leave the tithing undone that was laid out in Leviticus 27, 30 through 33. That's what they were talking about. That's what they were talking about. They should not have left the other undone. And so, when we come back, I'm going to share with you what these tithing spices look like, because the tithe is agricultural based on Leviticus. It was from the land. And here's the most important thing you need to understand. What I read from you from Leviticus, where he said tithe of the land, it was talking about the huge tithe that were coming from the farming that they did. The farming that they did. The law did not even include tithing spices from your plants at home. It really didn't. But the Pharisees were so much of a stickler to the law that they said, no, 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 no. They kind of built a fence around the law, so to speak, and said, well, we're going to make sure we're right. We're going to include even your plants at home, in your house, your little spices that you have at home. You're going to include that in the tithe. So we're going to be really perfect on that. But then justice, mercy, and faith, they didn't want to care about that at all. So we'll be right back, and I'm going to show you what is the tithe look like. I hope you're getting some really good information from this, and knowing that Matthew 23:23 is talking about edible items, ladies and gentlemen. It is not talking about the money in your wallet or the cash in your wallet or purse or whatever you have. This verse is talking about things that you eat. And so in the King James Version of the Bible, it calls out these same items, but it says mint, rue, and cumin. And so we're going to see right now what the tithe looked like. Yes, if they grew this on their big farms, here is some of your mint. Smells minty. You can make mint tea and put it in your vegetables. So Israel had to pay this as a tithe. This was a tithe. They tithed the mint. And rue was another herb that they used, and they tithed some rue. I didn't have actual rue from the grocery store, so I picked up a picture, printed out from Google, of what rue looks like. And you can probably go online and check out what rue looks like and what the grocery store looks like. I guess you can put it in anything, any of your food. And there are different kind of rue leaves that you can use. And so Israel, the Pharisees, were tithing this spice as well. And then, once again, you have another one that was mentioned in the King James Version, mint, rue, and cumin. So you can pick up some cumin, at the grocery store. All of this is what Matthew 23:23 is talking about. Cumin is probably not in its natural form here. It's been ground up, but you can see the leaves and the plants on the bottle. You can see it on the bottle here. Let me get my thing right. Get this right and get in close and get in close and get in close. There we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, Matthew 23:23 is talking about edible items. The tithe is edible items. The tithe in the Hebrew is called ma'asar. And if you know anything about Josephus, he defined that as a 10th part. As we read in the Contemporary English Version, he says the tithe from the land, from the harvest. not from your wallet, from your harvest. And so when I come back, I'm going to read a few excerpts from my book, Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway, concerning this verse in Matthew 23:23. And hopefully this will be enough information to get you started on studying the tithe in Matthew 23:23. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Dr. Frank Chase here again. So let's go to my book. I wanted to share my book with you, Tithing, Kleptomaniac, Who's Really Robbing God Anyway. It is an award-winning book, as you can see. It has won several awards. I don't have all the stickers on them, but they have won several awards at this point. But let's look at what was going on in Matthew 23:23. And I'm reading from my book. I'm not going to read a lot of this. I'm just going to read something to get you started. The master teacher is addressing Jewish teachers, Pharisees, and the disciples. This can be proven because we know the commandment to tithe is specific in the Torah, and nowhere does God, Paul, or any disciple issue an edict to tithe money in the new covenant. So the important thing that you need to know is this. When you're reading the book of Matthew is still under the law, still under the Old Testament. Why? Because the new covenant had not been established yet, because the Messiah had not gave his life. That's when the new covenant was officially established. In Matthew, it was still under the law. Mandatory tithing, mandatory monetary tithing, is an extra biblical system and is a burden on the poor, but easy on people who can support that financial system. So in Matthew, that's why you look at that chapter and you see all these woes being leveled against the leaders of the temple. So let's go to another place here and read. Today, we give under grace, and that does not mean moral codes are abandoned, because Matthew is still the old covenant, as I already said. The new covenant would not start until the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. With the old covenant still in play in Matthew 23:23, ladies and gentlemen, the audience knew that a land-based tithe was what Jesus spoke about in Matthew 23:23. Income-based tithing was not a practice in Matthew. Did you get that? Income-based tithing is not a practice in the book of Matthew and not a practice in the New Testament at all. Now, let's go someplace here. Let's go another place. Always pay attention to individual words when you're reading the Bible from different translations. When reading Bible verses, have you ever noticed that certain words are not the same across translations? For example, some translations in Matthew, depending on which one you read, say pay a tithe, and some say give a tithe in Matthew 23:23. This is done on purpose to set up a predisposed doctrinal theological ideology in the mind of the reader. It's a setup, ladies and gentlemen. Do words such as pay, give, and income establish different interpretation patterns in the minds of those who read the scripture? The answer is yes. So when you're reading Matthew 23:23, context is everything. Hermeneutics is everything. We know the context. The context is about growing stuff from the ground, growing stuff in plants. This is what was being done in Matthew 23, and this is what Jesus was talking about. And when we come back, I'm going to read another excerpt, and I'm going to leave that there to let you know that Matthew 23 is not talking about your paycheck. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. So I'm going to do this last excerpt, and we're going to close out with this. But then I want you to go and read the study, read my book, read the whole chapter I have on this, on Matthew 23:23, and you're going to get something out of it. So let's look at this. Let's look at this. Okay. Remember, the events in Matthew's gospel and the other gospels took place simultaneously when the temple stood and the old covenant was still in effect, with Levites performing temple duties and collecting agricultural and animal tithes. None of this had any connection to the new covenant because the old covenant still operated and had not been superseded by the new covenant. Matthew 23:23 does not apply to the ecclesia. The word church in the Bible means ecclesia in the Greek. It means congregation. Ecclesia, it means today's congregation of believers. Matthew 23:23 does not apply to the ecclesia, today's congregations. Many people assume that Matthew 23:23 was transferred to the New Testament ecclesia as a requirement. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not the case. This is not the case because the law applies only to the Hebrew people as a part of God's covenant with the Levites for their service in the temple. So the tithe was completely set up for the Levites and the high priest in the temple. That is not the system anymore today. The disciples were not Levites and did not work in the temple, and the physical rituals associated with the old covenant temple services in Jerusalem do not govern today's New Testament Christian congregations. That's why the tithe teachers cannot prove Christ paid or collected tithes during his ministry from age 30 to 33. Jesus never used tithe money to support his ministry or pay ministry expenses. You will never find Christ asking for a tithe from any temple or any synagogue in the Bible. Jesus never used tithe money to support his ministry or pay ministry expenses. Moreover, the Bible proves this in Luke 8:3. How did Christ support his ministry? And here's what it says, which details how he supported his ministry. Joanna, this is one example, the wife of Chusa, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others, these women were helping to support them out of their own means. Christ and the disciples were supported by private funds and free will offerings from many followers who believed, and not by tithes. Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The smoking gun. Christ's ministry was supported by other means than tithing, because tithing did not apply to money. If you get this book, you will have a decision to make if you do believe in tithing. When you read it, the scripture is profound. The scripture is correct. The scripture is exact. God's tithe has always been crops and livestock. And as I have said already, you could buy back part of your tithe. You did not have to pay it, but you did have to pay a penalty. But most people in Leviticus didn't use the buyback program because it simply was costing too much. And you do not want to create an aristocracy in the modern day church by paying tithes in the form of money, which the Bible does not allow. Because if you do, you will create mega rich pastors and you'll create a mega rich aristocracy in leadership that simply does not will not be sustainable, because you will have overwhelming poor people and overwhelming rich preachers. Ladies and gentlemen, do the Bible the correct way, give from your heart, and let the tithe be tithe, crops and cattle, according to the Bible. Well, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll come back. I don't do these videos very often, but I do when I need to, so that you can be sure that I'm still studying and still learning about God's tithe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.